Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. It's a pleasure for you to make time to hear about aquafailure. What an exciting topic. My name is François Monnier. I'm in charge of the ocean research, Planet Tracker. And here with me is Fuya Wang, my colleague, who has had the pleasure to work with us for a year on this topic. Today we're going to talk about how to avoid aquafailure. And probably many of you don't know what I mean at this stage, but I will explain very soon. Don't worry. Let's start first with what is Planet Tracker. For those of you who don't know, we're an NGO, a sustainable finance think tank. And our goal effectively is to convince investors that they should care about nature and align their investment with a sustainable future. What we'll talk about today is that high concentration increasingly characterize the aquaculture sector, both by species and by geography. And that leaves aquaculture companies vulnerable to biodiversity risk that they themselves contribute to create often, which lead to mounting financial losses, coastal conflict as well, and more regulatory scrutiny. And all of that in turn means that growth in the future will be capped. So without change, aquaculture will fail to meet the world's growing demand for seafood. This is what we call aquafailure. There are solutions, of course. Technology can help, but we'll see that it will not close this future demand gap on its own, nor fully solve the sector's environmental problems. Instead, diversification away from fed aquaculture towards regenerative aquaculture can achieve both, but it requires change and a lot of external capital.
Hi, everyone. My name is Fuya Wang. I'm a research analyst in the Oceans program at Planet Tracker. So today I will start with the concentration in aquaculture and happy to answer any questions you might have at the end of the session. So to begin with, aquaculture production does not replicate the species and the geographical diversity of wild marine ecosystem. Instead, it has concentrated on just a few species among the major producing countries. If we look at a figure, in 2020, the top 10 producing countries accounted for 88% of global total production, with China alone accounts for 57%. And China will continue to play a key role between now and 2050, according to FAO. If we move on to the species concentration, we can see that species concentration is high and has slightly intensified over years. In 2020, the top 20 named species account for 71% of the total aquaculture production, but this number is 32 for the wild catch. Given the concentration situation in the sector, along with our aquafailure report, we have developed an interactive dashboard, which allows users to discover how concentrated the seafood production is within a country or by species. You can find the link in the report or access to the dashboard on our website. Our database covers more than 200 countries and more than 600 species from 1950 to the latest. But the table here presents a snapshot of the top 10 producing countries. We also computed a species concentration index, which you can see from the table. Typically, a country with a value higher than 25% is considered a highly concentrated producing nation. For instance, Norway is highly concentrated, while China has a well-diversified seafood producing industry. So next, François will talk about what the consequences of the high concentration are and how that will impact the global seafood supply by 2050.
Thank you, Fuya. And sorry, there seems to be issues with my mouse today, and I'll try to avoid that being a complete failure. So the consequences of concentration, there are many, and I think they are too complex to grasp in just as me telling you a long sentence like this. So instead, what I'll do is give you two examples. The first one is an example from Chile. Chile is associated often with salmon production. And what is interesting about it from an environmental perspective is that there's a lot of overlap between salmon production, the location of salmon farms, and marine protected areas. As you can see here, about 30% of the farms actually sit somewhere in a marine protected area or overlap with these areas. Now, the problem is that in many of these farms, there is a lot of nutrient pollution. There's a lot of antibiotic use, and all of this contributes to negatively impacting the environment. One of the consequences being low oxygenation level, pollution in general, which itself contributes to mass mortality and significant losses for the industry. As we've seen all over the news, in the case of Chile, this might eventually upset governments or agencies in charge of regulation and leads to effectively heightened regulation. In the case of Chile, it was farms being asked to relocate, stop production, etc., etc. So that's just one example showing you how from an issue with concentration and impact on biodiversity, this actually might impact future growth. Second example on the other side of the world is Thailand. Let's look at shrimp production. It's very concentrated, both from a species point of view. Pretty much all of the shrimp production is one species called the Pacific white-leg shrimp, or the Vanay shrimp, if you know it better under that name, assuming you're into shrimps. And there's also geographical concentration as well. Now, what happened is that over the last 2 decades, actually, but mostly since 2011, let's say, there was a disease that has started to affect shrimp production. And it was a terrible disease in the sense that it killed juvenile shrimp with almost 100% mortality rate. Now, what scientists found out is that typically the more concentrated production was and the least environmental friendly it was, the more this disease was affecting shrimps. Now, the consequences were massive for the shrimp industry in Thailand. It more than halved between 2011 and 2022, but also for the country, of course, in general, with losses totaling more than $12 billion, which is huge. Not even mentioning the number of jobs that were at risk, Thailand having to actually import shrimp from Ecuador. Again, you see how an environmental issue turns into a risk, a financial risk and a capital growth. And we're seeing this over and over again. And this is why we're saying that we might be well heading towards aquafailure. Here is why we're coming up with this conclusion. When you look at total seafood production and total seafood demand, the first is production is in green, demand is in orange on this chart. What we've done, what actually Fuya did, was coming up with an estimate of seafood demand in 2050. It's the numbers that we couldn't find anywhere, so we estimated ourselves using a relatively complicated model. And we found out that the production level that was forecast by the FAO was way short out of that number. We actually identified a demand-supply gap of about 50 million tons. And that's what we're saying is that if the industry doesn't change, it won't produce enough seafood to feed the world. Now, you might well say, how about fishing? And here, I think even the most optimistic scenario do not project much growth for fishing. Actually, flat growth is probably what you could expect, given how overfished many stocks are. Which means that aquaculture has to feed the gap, and therefore, for us, in our opinion, needs to change to be able to do so. Now, the good news is that, of course, there are solutions, and we'll start with the technological solutions. Fuya is going to tell you about them.
Thanks, Francois. So there's 3 technological alternatives we will discuss here are offshore aquaculture, land-based ROS, and cultivated seafood. The solutions contribute to the seafood supply through different ways, and they are at a different stage. But they share a variety of benefits over conventional aquaculture, of course, such as providing fish producers greater flexibility in project siting so that producers could expand production capacity with less constraints or conflicts, but also producing high quality seafood with significantly less impact on wild animals. So next, we will take a closer look at how each of the solutions could help to avoid the aquafailure. The first is offshore aquaculture. This figure shows you how a typical offshore finfish aquaculture operates. So by moving farms to the offshore zone, the fish farmers can largely avoid the coastal conflicts with other users. And at the same time, the product quality can be improved as a result of improved water quality in dispersive water. The Norwegian salmon industry has been an early adopter of the technology, and the industry has the world-leading projects, both in operation and under development. And we see China is following up. By 2050, we estimate the offshore aquaculture to contribute a total of 2.7 million tons of seafood. And because of the offshore aquaculture is very capital intensive, as you can see, farming under the rough weather requires very durable and more expensive structures, and so higher capital costs. So the capex per kilogram production estimate from current projects stays in the range of $6 to $20. So depending on the scale, equipment type, and the location. As a result, we believe the production, it has been and will mainly focus on high value species, such as Atlantic salmon, large yellow cocker, snapper, and cobia, because they can offset or amortize the high cost. So now let's look at another technology which moves the seafood farming process onshore, which is ROS. So it refers to recirculating agricultural system. It is essentially technology for seafood farming by reusing water through continuous recirculation. Just like offshore, the capital and the operating costs for ROS are higher because the system itself is sophisticated and it requires higher energy and fresh water usage. The current capex per kilogram production ranges from $10 to $24. So again, Norway is a pioneer. We estimate ROS can contribute 1.4 million tons of seafood by 2050. And among all the species we mentioned here, Atlantic salmon will account for half of the total. Last but not least, we will talk about cultivated seafood or cell-based seafood. So that means cultivating animal cells directly to produce seafood. The cultivated seafood culture can feed the world with a wide range of proteins with much shorter cultivation time. So a typical cell culture could require only weeks to months to generate functional foods. So less emission, less water, and the land use compared to conventional aquaculture. That being said, cultivated seafood is one of the most technology-dependent forms of seafood production, and the current production pathways are far from cost-competitive. So because of that, the focus for the cultivated seafood market is very hard to combine at the current stage. But from the majority of the experts interviewed in 2021, the entire cultivated meat market will be less than 1 million tons. So we believe that 0.45 million tons by 2050 for the cultivated seafood is a reasonable estimate. So put them together, in total, technological solutions can produce 4.6 million tons of seafood by 2050. So that means technological alternatives could fill just 9% of the total seafood demand supply gap. I will just hand it over back to Francois to talk about how regenerative agriculture could play a key part here.
Yeah, thank you, Freya. So we've seen indeed that technological progress is not going to be enough, in our opinion, which is something we've observed over and over again when it comes to addressing environmental issues. What could address instead this shortfall in terms of production for seafood? We call that regenerative agriculture, not just because it tests the limit of my pronunciation, but also because we think it's not just a buzzword. What does that mean by regenerative? Effectively, it's the idea that you can produce seafood in a way that benefits ecosystem, which is a very nice change from what we typically hear about seafood. Why is that the case? Let's look at the typical species that could be associated with regenerative aquaculture. It's going to be either what we typically call seaweed, but also bivalves, which are mussels, clams, oysters, and many of these species, not all, of course, and if farmed in a certain way, not all of it, of course, as well, otherwise it would be too easy, can contribute to regenerative ecosystem. For instance, oysters can create habitat for other species. Mussels will filter water and therefore contribute to improve water quality. Seaweed also provide habitats for other organisms such as fish. If you redirect some of the production of seafood towards seaweed, you don't need to feed or you don't need to feed mussels or oysters or clams either. So effectively, you eliminated the feed issue associated with farmed fish. There is a carbon sequestration angle as well. Some studies argue that seaweed is much more effective than plants at carbon sequestration. It's, whatever the number you want to associate with how effective it is a good sequester, if that's a word, of carbon. Clam farming is a net carbon sink, etc., etc. The examples can go on and on. So overall, what we argue is that there is both the potential from a production perspective to massively increase the production of these two groups of seafood, and also a reason to do so. Now, the financial angle on top of that is how much is it going to cost, and that is quite challenging to estimate, but nonetheless, we are tempted. Here in this table, you have a comparison of the capital expenditures that are needed, as in the investment that is needed to produce 1 kilogram of seafood under different production method. Regenerative is on the right. You can see it's the cheapest one. And in our opinion, it's not going to change much by 2050, effectively, because there is not a massive amount of technology that is associated with them. In contrast, we believe that RAS, cultivated seafood, or offshore are going to become cheaper, but still, in comparison, more expensive than regenerative aquaculture. And what does that mean? If we try to wrap it all, that means that we've seen that both technological solutions and regenerative aquaculture are needed to close the gap that we identified. So in blue here, you can see regenerative aquaculture that we believe will make up for close to 45 million, a million tons, of seafood, compared to technological solutions that will total 4.6 and therefore close the demand-supply gap. How much will this cost in total? How much investment is necessary? Again, because of the range of estimates, it is quite hard to forecast an exact number, but if you take the bottom range, that is therefore the bottom of all of these bar charts here, this will add up to at least $55 billion US dollars, and at a higher range, more than double that. So quite a high range, a lot of investment that is necessary in the industry. But the question is, can the industry afford it? And our answer is sadly no, not on its own. Of course, there are exceptions, but overall, what we've tried to do is assess the potential of each group of species, if you want, to be able to invest in transition towards regenerative aquaculture, for instance. So we've grouped companies by species. We went through 57 listed companies and grouped them by species: salmon, shrimp, grouper, bivalves, etc., etc. And conclusions is that for salmon, the industry can, in theory, expand and invest a little bit more, even though there's already quite a high level of debt and has spent already a lot of its operating cash flow in capex, about 2/3 here. Shrimp are going to find it difficult, as you can see it here. Grouper as well, mostly because the industry is significantly loss-making. The same goes for pangasius, typically in Vietnam. And the bivalves and seaweed industry itself is typically a highly fragmented market with smaller companies with limited access to finance. So that is itself a challenge that we wanted to highlight. Which means that investors need to play their part, investors and lenders. We looked here at the typical funding of companies, and with the exception of salmon in Norway, bank loans are by far the most frequent source of funding for these companies, which highlights the key role of banks, lenders, or common lenders, if you want, just like a typical bank, to propel this kind of investment to support them, and we think is very important. And of course, as well, equity investors. And talking about investors and lenders in general, what we would ask them, we would ask investors and lenders to be worried about this risk, the risk that we described at the beginning. Business as usual is no longer a possibility. At the very least, increased disclosure, transparency, and traceability need to be demanded, but we argue that companies need to go further. They need to diversify towards technological investment only if they're environmentally sound to do, and also regenerative aquaculture. In our opinion as well, investors and lenders should offer cheaper capital for sustainable expansion. It is in the benefit of everyone, companies, and also, of course, the environment. So now we have a little bit of time for questions and answers, hopefully. So if you have any more questions, you can put them in the chat. I can see there are some of them already, which we'll try to address in order. So let me see. I think I have the answer to that one, but correct me if that's not the case. We have a question here from Emma de Roche. Apologies, I'm trying to pronounce this with a French accent. Maybe it's not the right way to do so. But when discussing the failure to meet aquaculture demand, is it solely demand for food, or is it for other commercial and pharmaceutical purposes? I think our numbers is solely for food consumption. Is that correct, Fuya? Yeah. Okay.
It is.
So I think that was an easy one. Another question that we have is from Chris Hegadon, which can you please explain the lowball estimate from the FAO? I think this is the FAO built 3 scenarios for you. Do you want to give more detail of each of these 3 scenarios, and what is the conclusion for each of them?
Sir, can I please just confirm the question is about the FAO seafood production supply instead of our...
I think so, yeah, I think so. That would probably be my guess, at least.
Yes, definitely. So if this is the case, I would just address from the FAO published last year. So they do provide a 3 scenario case, a projection of the seafood production by 2050. And then we adopted the business as usual scenario here, which is considered by FAO, which is highly likely happen. So in this scenario, that means the wild catch would keep in the same trend as what happened over the past decade. And then the aquaculture production could improve a little bit because of the technology improvement, because of the adoption of a limited sustainable production methodology. And of course, we do have another scenario is high road scenario. High road scenario, we estimate from FAO with the adoption of technology, which we include offshore aquaculture, ROS, and other technological solutions could help with the aquaculture production, but also in the wild catch, the overfishing situation could be mitigated a little bit. And then for the low road scenario, that means, the overfishing will continue to happen. And then as a result, the aquafeed will be capped. As a result of the soaring price of aquafeed, the aquaculture production will be capped as well. So this is basically the 3 scenario provided by FAO by 2050.
Thank you, Freya. That's very comprehensive. We have another question, and I think it's something that is a very fair point and that we address in the report. And the question is about effectively, if regenerative aquaculture is so great, why has it not been implemented more widely, at least in Western areas? And I think that is a fair point, specifically to highlight at least in Western areas. I can think of one answer in particular. One is a food safety related answer. If mussels, let's say, or oysters filter water, that means they basically accumulate in the bodies all of the nasties that are in the water, and therefore are a key source of potential disease. And that means that there's been a lot of food safety related concerns associated with that, which have implication as well for how the products are transported and how close they are from the production level, etc., etc. And there are solutions for these, and these are slowly being addressed. And I think another one is around cultural preferences, which takes time to move and to change. When I was much younger, I remembered that no one knew what sushi were in my hometown, and now it's just very, very common. So just to give you an idea, these things do change. We at Plant Tracker are trying to eat a lot of seaweed to eat what we're preaching. But we agree that indeed these things take time to change. Maybe another question, I'll take them in order as they come, because we seem to have quite a bit. Do you expect that the growing demand for seaweed will only take place in regions and countries that already consume them? And I think here the answer will be no, it depends, not necessarily only in this area. I don't know if you want to add something else, but I think that would be the straightforward answer.
Yes, I definitely see the bivalves and the seaweed, particularly seaweed, is as Francois mentioned, because of in the past the food safety has been a concern, but over time, because of technology progress, and then we see most of the food safety situation could be addressed. And the other one is definitely the awareness of customer. So as we can see, for example, I'm from China, so as an Asian, we used to eat a lot of seaweed and bivalves, since when I was young. But when I moved to the UK, 5 years ago, this is not the case in the Western countries, of course. Even, I remember last week I was eating some nori, and then I guess most of people wouldn't really know what nori it is. So, so we definitely expect, over time, and when, people in Western countries could definitely understand what kind of food on the seaweed is. And then, by increasing the customer awareness, we definitely expect this kind of, consumption would grow in new markets.
Yeah, definitely. A very interesting question, and I'm happy to answer this one, which is how can investors contribute to a fragmented market? How can NGOs and groups work to bring the seafood companies together to work towards this? I think, of course, I would say that, but we have an interest at Plant Tracker in engaging investors, and more recently, together with WWF, FAIR, UNEP-FI, and the World Benchmarking Alliance, we announced an initiative to bring seafood to engage together to engage investors together as a collective. So if you're interested, if you want to be part of this, please feel free to reach out to any of the NGOs and groups that I've mentioned. We'd be very happy to work together. The UNEP-FI also organized a sustainable finance working group, which is very helpful. And I would also be very happy to introduce any of you who would be willing to join that group. We've got another question that I think is very interesting, and it's about the possibility of having regenerative salmon farming. And I think this touches onto the limits as to what regenerative aquaculture can be. On land, regenerative agriculture tends already to be subject to some form of greenwashing. If you're interested in the different forms of greenwashing, we wrote a paper on that, so I'm not going to elaborate. But just to say that indeed, the definition of regenerative aquaculture that we've chosen in this report is a very strict one. There needs to be a net positive for the ecosystem, not net positive in the sense of using offsets, but actually just by purely existing the business, creating something positive. We have not researched specifically whether this could be the case for salmon, My go-to answer would be most likely not, but it depends on how I would argue how the salmon is being fed, and perhaps if it's fed with a combination of most environmentally friendly feeds and grown in area with zero or extremely limited nutrient pollution, maybe, but it would probably need a more basically a more thorough answer. We've got another question which arrived on the chat directly to me, saying, where can I access the dashboard that Fuya mentioned? What will it show me? I think that's a fair point. I think maybe Fuya, you can put back the link to the report to the dashboard in the chat. But this is effectively an interactive dashboard that allows you to assess where the production of seafood takes place. Not just in terms of farmed seafood, but also fishing. Where does it take place by country, and which species are being produced? And you will see in the case of aquaculture, we've created a concentration index that in many cases, the production is very concentrated, either in a few countries or either on a few species, which is not the case for wild catch fishing. Effectively, farmed food, as always, farmed seafood, as always, does not replicate the fantastic diversity that there is in nature, but focus on a few species and try to scale them up. And so this dashboard allows you to have a look at basically have a look at this, so that you can estimate the exposure of different companies to potentially different risks. I would add that this dashboard is probably best looked at in conjunction with our seafood database, which provides you with a lot of indication at the company level. So it will give you overfishing risk, IUU risk, and many other risks, both for fishing and aquaculture from a company perspective. So if you look at both of them together, you might get a lot of your answers, the answers that you're looking for. Okay. We have another probably 10 minutes left, so more time for questions. Have you considered a risk around availability of feed for salmon and other carnivorous fish, and how to source feed in a food-constrained world from climate-warm oceans? Well, that's a great question as well, and we talk about this in the report. I think our answer is that if you address the problem of feed for farmed seafood, you've addressed probably one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest source of cost. And perhaps it was a little bit extreme in our opinion, but in your opinion, but to address that risk, the best way was to move towards non-fed aquaculture, which is why we're talking about seafood, regenerative seafood, regenerative aquaculture. So that was simply our answer. When it comes to what's the impact of climate on feed, then I think I can't answer this in like 10 seconds, because the impact of climate change on different oceans varies enormously. Some places go warmer, some places will have a different acidity level, etc. Populations of any given species will move, etc., etc. So it becomes way too complicated. So I'll probably stay away from that. Okay, maybe Fuya, maybe do you have an answer for George's question, which is about alternative land-based technology, hybrid flow-through system versus the RAS system used by Atlantic Sapphire? If not, yes, we can get back to Georgie directly.
Yes, definitely. We've seen some companies some have adopted the hybrid flow-through system, as you said, or some other companies are using the RAS. So basically, the difference here lies the degree of the recirculation of the water. So typically, the hybrid flow-through system requires around 60%, while RAS requires at least 90%. I mean, we definitely see this is a hybrid system is a transition to the ROS system. And then I definitely agree, Atlantic sapphire has, demonstrated some like high mortality rate. But over time, we definitely see, ROS could provide potentially, provide more, I would say, more advantages by, as the technology become more mature and the industry become more mature. Because current situation is ROS requires very much higher, energy and freshwater usage. But some innovators such as Salmon Evolution, they have already committed to powering ROS facilities with renewable energy. But at the same time, the ROS system provides better control in the system that ultimately allow fish to be cultivated in higher stocking densities. For example, salmon and cobia can be raised two or three times higher density without negative effect. So we believe that better input and water control could decrease the cost for health and disease treatment in the long run. So in the long run, we definitely see ROS as a very beneficial technology, could also drive the cost down. But at the current stage, the technology itself is not mature enough. So we have witnessed a couple of failure in the industry. So yeah, I definitely agree, at the current stage, if we could cooperate them together toward the transition would be a better way.
Thank you, Fuya. I think another one for you, sorry, to warn you in advance, try to merging two questions here, hazard and Paul's question, which is effectively about whether we anticipate that consumer demand for bivalves and seaweed is gonna materialize or not really. And there's a question about how palatable they are to human tastes, and will they replace the tonnage missing from prawn? Anecdotally, I could say that, I remember salmon being a delicacy when I grew up, and so were oysters. Oysters, I would say, typically remain one, salmon, not really, but I don't know. If maybe I'm sure Fuya has a much smarter answer.
Sorry, I'm just trying to read through the question here. Definitely, I mean, the regenerative aquaculture, different, we in the report we discussed how, even why the technological alternatives could help, but eventually could not fill the gap. The main the key reason here is about the, how the aquafeed could cap the aquaculture production, in the future. So we see the soaring growth of fish meal, fish oil, and some companies has already tried, soil as another alternative aquafeed, but then we see the, associated deforestation risk as well. And we also see some alternative insects, proteins, as, to trying to bridge this gap, but we haven't seen anything like scaling up at the current stage. So that is why we mentioned, regenerative aquaculture. Most of the bivalves and seaweed, they feed on, some supplements in the water. They do not require any kind of fertilizer. They do not require any feed. This is how we see, regenerative aquaculture could provide, provide the nutrition, but at the same time would not really rely on the fish feed in the future. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Fuya. I see an interesting question, which is about the risk of seaweed cultivation. And the question is about, is there any risk to wider coastal ecosystem from rapidly scaling up seaweed cultivation? I think the key risk here is looking at the key drivers of biodiversity loss. One of them that we don't address often enough, and at Planet Tracker, we're also guilty of this, to be honest, and that's invasive species. And if there was a tendency to select the most, let's say, efficient on paper on an Excel spreadsheet of the fastest growing seaweed species that might be originating from somewhere in the Northwestern Pacific Ocean, and just introduce it to some area in, let's say Norway, that could, of course, lead to many issues in terms of the ecosystem. So I would think bringing invasive species as one being the key risk that you could imagine. anecdotally, most of the oyster production in Europe is actually a species that does not originate from Europe at all. So that's also something to bear in mind. There's another question which is about the risk of fish feed to regenerative aquaculture, which I think the answer is straightforward. In our case, there's no need to feed the species that we're talking about, so I don't think that's a risk. Sebastian has a question, sorry, on HHI and what it stands for. So HHI is an index that is used typically by the Department of Justice in the US to measure the risk of concentration before and after a merger, typically. Stands for, and it's in the report, I think it's something like Hirschman-Herfindel index. And it's basically the sum of the squared market share of companies, or in this case, we adapted it to species in a given area. So if you have a number that is 80, that would mean that a very high concentration level. So on a 0 to 100 scale, or let's say 0 to 1, depending on how you want to base it. And so in the dashboard, that's the one that we're using. Happy to help you further if you have any more question. Another question that I got, and I think we'll probably stop after that one, unless there's time for a second one. Which is, if you follow your strategy and move to bivalves and seaweed, will we not just have moved the concentration risk elsewhere? I think that's an interesting question. What we're saying in the report is not that concentration in isolation is an issue. What we're saying is that concentration typically comes with increased environmental risk. Typically is the key here. It's not necessarily the case. Now, when we talk about producing seaweed or bivalves, I think here we would not move that risk elsewhere because there is, I don't know how many, I forgot, but an enormous amount of species that could be adapted to what we call regenerative aquaculture, which means that by definition, the species concentration risk would actually probably diminish. And in terms of area that is theoretically suitable to produce this species, again, there is an enormous amount of acreage, or no matter what's your preferred unit, that is suitable to that. So actually, no, I would argue this is the opposite. You don't move the concentration risk elsewhere, you just contribute to dilute that risk, actually. And I will just finish on that question because I think it's a great one. A question from Joseph Boyle saying, I think very rightly, that seafood fishing and farming industry are not the largest issuers or borrowers on public markets. So how can investor influence and engage further down the supply chain? We have a whole body of research and engagement dedicated to that issue. I think the short answer is that the supply chain is huge. The seafood supply chain, we've quantified its revenue is equal to the GDP of Italy, to give you an order of magnitude, $1.8 trillion. And so if you choose your target rightly, it could be a large retailer, it could be a massive production company, like, I don't know, Mitsubishi, for instance, also produce seafood. The number one seafood production company, Maruha Nichiro, is huge as well. There are many, many companies that are very, very large. So there are different ways to address them, but one of them that we think is underused is basically via fixed income instruments. So whether it's loans, that would be typically our answer. That would be loans. So that would be our main answer. And there was a second part of the question, which is policy and regulation. And here we would argue that redirecting subsidies is an important route. We've seen it for fishing. We might see it for fishing, sorry, where we hope that subsidies that support that contribute to overfishing could be redirected to traceability. It would be great if we saw something similar for aquaculture. Okay, so we're 1 minute late already against what we promised. We will send answer to the others questions by email. Thank you for sending so many questions. We're a little bit overwhelmed. We will send an answer by email. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for joining us.